Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian angle on what's going on in the world. And of course, this weekend we celebrated Independence Day, the 4th of July. So, what better thing to talk about than the 4th of July? You know, in the celebration that takes place at this time of year, it's tempting to focus on the military victory that took place by the revolutionaries over their own government. But actually, that's not really the big message as I see it from what happened on the 4th of July, 1776. The big revolutionary feat that was accomplished on that day was the message that was sent out in the Declaration of Independence. We take it for granted nowadays, but it is such a radical message. It's a message that continues to shock the world. In fact, I think that if a lot of Americans really reflected on what Jefferson was writing, and he was just expressing the sentiments of his fellow British citizens. Because keep in mind, these were British citizens. These were not Americans. These were British citizens who had decided to take up arms against their own government. They had examined what their government was doing. They had made a critical analysis of it. They believed it was wrong. They believed that what the government was doing was a grave and severe infringement on their freedom. So they decided to take up arms against their own government. And the sentiments that Jefferson expressed in the Declaration really expressed at least most of the people who were joining up with the revolutionaries. It certainly wasn't unanimous. It's been estimated that 1/3 sided with the troops, with the British troops, that sided with their government. 1/3 stayed neutral, and the 1/3 said, we are severing ties with this government, and we are attempting to establish our own government here. Now, what is that message that is so radical that continues to shock the world and especially shock government officials? What Jefferson said in the Declaration was that everybody, every person, has been endowed with certain fundamental, God-given, inherent rights. Rights that pre-exist government. Now, notice the logical corollary of this, that if people have been endowed with fundamental inherent rights, that means that government cannot infringe on these rights. That means that there are severe limits on the power of governments. Now, government officials don't like to hear that kind of message. They like to think that, hey, their powers over the citizen are unlimited, at least many rulers around the world. It's not difficult to find rulers that have that kind of mindset. The mindset goes all the way back to the year 1215, and that was the year of Magna Carta. Now, prior to Magna Carta, the King John at that time, he took the position that the citizens are going to do whatever he orders them to do, that his powers over them are omnipotent, that they are effectively serfs, not exactly slaves, but essentially the same kind of principle. That whatever the king decides to do, if he decides to send his forces over to pick up somebody, take him over to to the Tower of London to be tortured, that's what would happen. There were no limits on the power of the king to do whatever he wanted. And people believed that. I mean, people did not sit there and question and say, oh, well, the king doesn't have the right to do this. That never even occurred to anyone, that the king could not do whatever he wanted to do. If he wanted to seize somebody's property, he didn't even have to call it taxes. He could just go over there and grab it. He'd send his soldiers over there, his standing army, and they would enforce whatever he told them to. So what's significant about Magna Carta is that it sent out a very dramatic message. Now, there's, of course, critics of Magna Carta. They say, oh, it really wasn't that big a deal because the barons that had King John sign Magna Carta, they didn't have jury trials in there and right to counsel and right to subpoena witnesses and, all the right to bail and right to habeas corpus. And, well, they really missed the point. You can't expect people when they're first starting out in an endeavor to all of a sudden have this clear-cut, black and white vision of what a free society looks like. That freedom comes through fits and starts, but it's got to come with a first step. And Magna Carta was the first step. That with Magna Carta, the barons of England get King John to acknowledge publicly and formally that his powers are limited. That was a shocking notion. Like I say, it's a shocking notion today to a lot of rulers that feel that their powers over people are unlimited. And so here, all of a sudden, King John was saying, I acknowledge in this document that my powers over you, my citizenry, are limited in nature. Now, granted, there wasn't, a great big exposition of what that meant. They didn't flesh out all the details, trial by jury, right to bail, and so forth, because it was just a first step. But it was a critical first step because it's the first time that the king is saying, okay, my powers are limited. Okay, so now we've got to decide over the eons, what does that mean? What does it mean when your powers are limited? What powers do you have? What are your legitimate powers? What are the legitimate restraints on government? Now, there was another important thing about Magna Carta. There's a clause in there that says that the king will not seize anybody in violation of what was called the law of the land. Again, no real clear-cut notion of what that meant. But what it was an acknowledgement by King John that he couldn't just arbitrarily go seize people anymore, that he had to follow whatever the meaning was, the law of the land. Now, that phrase, the reason that phrase is so critically important is it gradually, over the centuries of resistance to British tyranny, that phrase evolves into a phrase that we're all familiar with. That phrase is due process of law. Now, you'll recognize that phrase. It's found in the Fifth Amendment. It's found in the 14th Amendment. It says that the federal government, on the Fifth Amendment, does not have the power to go out and arrest people, punish people, deprive people of their life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And over the centuries, that came to be meaning notice. You've got to give somebody notice of a crime. You can't just go pick them up and take them to the Tower of London or take them over to a rape chamber where the soldiers are permitted to rape them. None of that anymore. That what you had to do, you had to give somebody notice of the charges before he could have his life, liberty, or property taken away, and an opportunity to be heard. I mean, this was a radical notion as it developed. And that right to be heard evolved into a trial, and then a trial by jury where people can elect not to have a judge who's just a lawyer, who a lot of people don't trust, and rightfully so. They have the right to bring just regular citizens into a court and decide guilt or innocence, or decide the facts in a civil suit. So the idea was planted in Magna Carta, but here's Jefferson now. Jefferson's enunciating it to the world. He's saying people are endowed with certain fundamental God-given rights that no government, not even a democratically elected government, can legitimately infringe upon. Now, notice that there's something important here. Jefferson isn't saying American citizens are endowed with fundamental rights. He's saying everyone has these rights, and that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. For example, when we talk about immigration controls, people don't like to think in terms of that foreigners have the right to life, the right to sustain their life through labor, the right of liberty, to enter into mutually beneficial economic relations with people, including employment agreements, and the right to pursue happiness. So notice how radical Jefferson's message is. He's saying this doesn't just apply to Americans. He's saying this applies to everyone. And no government, not even a democratic government, can legitimately infringe upon, interfere with the exercise of these fundamental rights, life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. And that wasn't all of them. I mean, he said among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the seeds planted Magna Carta. All of a sudden, Jefferson's just full force with this message. And that really is the significant thing about the 4th of July. That message that everyone has fundamental rights. Now, notice something else Jefferson says. He says that whenever any government, even a democratically elected government, becomes destructive of the legitimate ends of the people, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Imagine that. So if a government starts destroying their fundamental rights of the people, Jefferson is saying people have a right to simply dismantle, alter, modify, abolish that government and institute new government that is designed to protect these fundamental rights. Now, that's a radical notion too. No government wants to hear that. Where if a government's infringing on people's rights, they figure, hey, they've got the authority to do that. That's not what Jefferson's saying. Jefferson's saying, ultimate sovereignty lies with the citizens. That if the citizens decide that this government's become destructive, they can go in there and through their elected representatives, for example, in Congress, and start repealing, dismantling, abolishing the obstructions, the apparatuses, the structures, the laws, the departments, the agencies that are infringing or destroying these fundamental rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness and other rights. Now, there was another interesting thing that happened in 1776, and that was the publication of one of the most remarkable books that's ever been published. And we know it as by the name The Wealth of Nations. The real name is An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. It's written by a Scottish philosopher, everybody knows, Adam Smith. And the real monumental achievement of Smith was not that he came up with any brilliant economic insights, because, I mean, The Wealth of Nations is a difficult read. It's turgid, it's complicated, it's fuzzy, it's gray. I mean, here were the seeds, really, of Marxism, with the labor theory of value, and there's seeds for the cost of production theory of value. There's also seeds for what the Austrians are famous for, the subjective theory of value, that the value of an item is based not on how much labor goes into producing it or how much time it takes to produce it, but rather just it's subjective. It depends on the eye of the beholder. All of this is in Smith's book. But the real monumental achievement of Smith was that he, for the first time, put the study of economics into a systematic treatise. And so it's divided into logical areas of prices and the market and so forth. And so here Smith is saying, okay, here is a treatise on economics, which people had talked about, these various ideas that Smith talked about, but nobody had put it all together. Here Smith puts it all together. But he did more than that. He says, okay, what are the nature and causes of the wealth of nations? Notice that Smith isn't saying, what are the causes of poverty? That's the question that that people ask today. Well, hey, what are the causes of poverty? How can we wage war on poverty or defeat poverty? Well, poverty has always been the natural state. I mean, most people in history have been poor, and especially before 1776. As Hobbes said, life was nasty, brutish, and short. I mean, that was a reason why people got married at 12 years old and so forth, because they weren't going to live very long. Longevity, maybe they'd hit their 20s, 25, 30. And so Smith said, okay, let's ask, what are the causes of the wealth of nations? Why is it that some nations are wealthier than other nations? Is it natural resources? A lot of people argue that today. And yet, you look at a place like Mexico that's got all the oil it needs and more, or Venezuela, all the oil there, and yet people are very poor in these countries. So it can't be natural resources. And education, they say, oh, well, education gets you a higher standard of living, and yet, you've got the state involved in education. Of course, some of us libertarians would never call that an education, but the state's involved in schooling, and like in Cuba, has been for decades, in North Korea, and terribly impoverished societies there. What Smith said was that the reason that people have been mired in poverty, if we want to go back to the idea of the cause of poverty, is because governments have been permitted the powers to wage war on poverty. That if you want to have a wealthy, prosperous nation, stop the government from waging war on poverty. In other words, stop all of the regulatory laws, really the mercantilist laws at that time, where the government would regulate the most minute aspects of people's economic activities. I mean, telling the seamstress how much, how many sweaters to produce, what colors and what sizes, because it was this common belief that if government wasn't, directing this economic activity, that, I mean, well, imagine no sweaters would be constructed one year. Well, Smith says, get government out of economic activity, okay? And then watch economic prosperity boom, because now people are engaged in economic enterprise. They're specializing. They're figuring out what their talents are, and so they start furnishing goods and services in the marketplace to others in accordance with what they're good at. Some will start businesses. Others will go to work for businesses. Gradually, as Smith said, you start accumulating capital. And over time, we start discovering, and the Austrians have made significant contributions here through entrepreneurship and capital, that people become more productive. And as people become more productive, there's more wealth being produced. That wealth then leads to higher wages through the competitive process. There's a dynamism that's taking place. So, in other words, what we're talking about here in the Wealth of Nations is a revolutionary idea. I mean, prior to this time, governments had always regulated the economic activity of people. Smith is saying, stop the regulation. Stop government from taking care of people, from watching over people. Leave economic activity free. I mean, in the terms of the French, laissez-faire, laissez-passer. Let it be. Let it be free. Let it pass. Get government out of the way. And so here you have, notice, these two remarkable, revolutionary ideas taking place in the exact same year. You've got the idea of fundamental rights with which no government can legitimately interfere with. And then you've got over here the idea of an unhampered market economy. And as these two ideas now, and people were reading the Wealth of Nations from 1776 on. The Revolutionary War takes time where they finally prevail, and then they have the Articles of Confederation for more than 10 years or so. The Constitution is brought into existence in 1791 when it's finally ratified. During that time, from 1776 to 1791, people are reading The Wealth of Nations. It was a popular book, no matter how difficult it was to read. And they're mulling over this idea that Jefferson, and of course the whole world's mulling over Jefferson's idea, because it posed a severe threat to totalitarian, authoritarian, omnipotent government regimes. Because he's saying everybody's got these fundamental rights, and any government that destroys them, infringes on them, people have a right to alter or abolish the government. Now, notice something else. That Jefferson's not just saying that this is limited to peaceful alteration of government. He's saying that when tyranny gets so bad that people have a right to overthrow their government violently. Now, granted, it's not an advisable thing. Jefferson said people will put up with a lot of tyranny before they revolt, and rightfully so, because of the horrible death and destruction that inevitably comes from a revolution. And of course, you never know what's going to come up after the revolution. Sometimes you can end up with a bigger tyranny after the revolution. And so people, as Jefferson said, don't revolt lightly, for just minuscule reasons. The tyranny has to really be bad for them to take up arms against their own government and revolt. Now, of course, this was more of a nature of a secession, a separation, because the people that were fighting the Revolutionary War on the side of the colonists, the British colonists, were not trying to take over the British government. They just said, leave us alone, get out of this part of the world. But in order to understand the Constitution and what the Constitution brings into existence, it's necessary to think in terms of the Declaration of Independence, as well as Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. They've all got to kind of be read together, because that's what was going into people's thinking as they were putting this thing together in Philadelphia in the Constitutional Convention. Now, look at the nature of the government they bring into existence. This is the other thing that's just unbelievably radical. Now, we know there were exceptions, horrible exceptions, slavery, and which of course is the horrific exception. And then there's the less horrific, the tariffs, the land grants to the railroads, canals, and so forth. But Let's look at the positive side of what came into existence in 1791. You've got a government of limited powers. This shocked the world because here were people were having to approve the Constitution, remember, that was calling into existence the federal government. So the federal government was viewed as a servant because we, the people, are bringing it into existence. And then you go back to this idea of fundamental rights and limitations on power that stretch all the way back to Magna Carta, that then Jefferson talks about in the Declaration. All of a sudden, you have this structure that's brought into existence, a federal government whose powers are limited. Okay, what were the limitations? And this is what was so revolutionary about the Constitution. They said, your powers are limited to these few that are enumerated in the document. Nobody had ever done that before. Nobody had ever said to a government, we're going to call you into existence with extremely limited powers, and these are the only powers you will be permitted to exercise. I mean, people around the world looked at this and said, my gosh, what is going on here? Everybody knows that government's powers are omnipotent. Everybody knows that government can do to the citizens whatever they want. The government's in charge. It's the master. The citizens to serve. And all of a sudden, these strange people who had been British citizens not long before are now American citizens saying, here is our government, and its powers are limited to these few. That wasn't good enough for Americans. They didn't trust this government. I mean, they really didn't like what had happened in Philadelphia. It had been done entirely in secret. And they thought that it was a meeting, they had been led to believe that it was just a meeting to modify the Articles of Confederation, where the federal government's powers were extremely weak. I mean, how many people know that the federal government didn't even have the power to tax? And it kind of gives you an idea of how Americans, the former British citizens, viewed government and the federal government and viewed taxation. The federal government had no power to tax at all under the Articles of Confederation. That went on for more than a decade. Well, you've got the way they got their money is they relied on contributions from the states, which of course had taxation. But the citizenry still were not satisfied with this new federal government. They were concerned that it would become a government of omnipotent powers. It become like the British government and all governments in history, where it was, have the power to seize people arbitrarily, take them into concentration camps, torture them, rape them, seize their property arbitrarily. And the proponents of the Constitution said, you don't need to worry about all that, because that's not enumerated in these documents. You don't need to worry about them jailing critics of government, torturing them and raping them and so forth, because that's not among the enumerated powers. That wasn't good enough for Americans. They really didn't trust this government, this federal government. I mean, it really goes to show you the mindset, how different these people were in the 1790s. They said, okay, we will let this government come into existence, but only on the condition that immediately after it's approved, the Constitution's approved, that there will be amendments to it. The first 10 amendments. And that was the condition. And okay, the proponents of the Constitution said fine. So that's how we get the First Amendment. Now, people think, oh, well, the First Amendment gives you freedom of speech. No, it doesn't. I mean, I had this debate in a public high school one time. It was a big assembly, and it's like 3 classes together singing. And I said, First Amendment doesn't give you the freedom of speech. And man, those kids got so mad at me that I was crazy. I didn't know what I was talking about. Everybody knows that First Amendment gives you freedom of speech. And finally, and I wouldn't give them the answer. I wouldn't give them the answer. I said, no, you're wrong. And I kept saying it. And finally, a little girl raises her hand and she says, I know, Mr. Hormer, what the answer is. The First Amendment doesn't give freedom of speech. It prohibits the government from interfering with freedom of speech. And you see, there's a distinct difference there. Because remember, rights inhere in people, naturally, God-given rights. They pre-exist government, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So government doesn't give you freedom of speech. The First Amendment prohibits the government from infringing on freedom of speech. So they understood the difference here. Now notice that the reason they enacted that First Amendment, because they knew that government would do this type of thing. The federal government would do it. Even if democratically elected, even if George Washington were in charge, they said, we want to make it clear that the government lacks this power. And the same thing with the Second Amendment, lacks the power to seize people's guns, because they understood, because of Lexington and Concord, that the ownership of guns is one of the keys to a free society, because it keeps the potential tyrants in check. Because they know then that people have not only the right to resist, they have the means to resist. But well, I shouldn't say the real critical ones, because they're all critical, but among the real critical ones are the Fourth, Fifth, Sixth, and Eighth Amendments. These are the procedural amendments, the ones that have been carved out. Notice they're not referring to God-given rights here. These are procedural guarantees that arise in the context of government trying to do bad things to its own people, to its own citizens. And so this, like the Fifth Amendment takes the wording back to Magna Carta. You will not deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And that means notice and opportunity to be heard, a trial. And then there's guarantee of trial by jury, and the right to bail and right to confront witnesses. You're not going to bring up hearsay in a courtroom, because that doesn't give the person the opportunity to cross-examine the witnesses. And all of this is saying, we don't trust the government. And that was the mindset that went into this. And they said, if you go after somebody, you're going to have to follow the time-honored procedural guarantees that have been carved out century after century after century since Magna Carta. Now, of course, there's habeas corpus in there too, and that was in the original Constitution. And all that was saying that if you ever seize somebody, that person has a right to file a petition in an independent court. That's what the federal judiciary was all about, saying that, hey, where the judge orders the government, the executive branch, to bring the person into court and show cause as to why they're holding him. And if they're not going to bring him any charges, that judge is going to order him released. All this was a shocking thing to people, because it was all there, like written out, part of the structure of government. It was really the most unusual society in history. Now, if you look at it from the economic side, now remember, with the other side of this thing is Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. Notice what they did. Now, again, we're not focusing on the negative side, the slavery. We all know that was really bad, the tariffs, protective tariffs, and so forth. What we're looking at is the positive, the glass half full business. That notice the kind of society they bring into existence. No income tax, no IRS, no. Well, keep in mind that government expenses were very, very small, because the government's not doing very much. There's certainly no welfare state. There's no Social Security, no Medicare, no Medicaid, no farm subsidies, no foreign aid, no welfare to speak of. Okay, well, that eliminates a lot of expenditures of government. The criminal cases, murder, rape, theft, and so forth, those are being handled at the state and local level. So there was very little for the federal government to be doing, which means it didn't cost a lot of money. No income tax, no IRS. You made it, you got to keep it. And then you decide what to do with it. So there was like this separation of charity in the state, because there was no power of the federal government in those enumerated powers to give away money to people, to be good with money that had been taxed from citizenry. They didn't have that power. And, gold and silver coins is the medium of exchange. That's for more than 100 years. Now, people today say, oh, you mean paper money was backed by gold? No. What it meant was that gold and silver coins was the money. Now, there were paper notes where the government promised to pay people money, but that was a promise to pay gold and silver coins. The gold and silver coins were the real money. That was the monetary system of the United States. No central bank, no Federal Reserve, no drug laws, no gun control, no public schooling to speak of. I mean, this is the most unusual society in history. And this is what people called freedom. Okay? Now, no big standing army, no Pentagon. I mean, if you want to see what the founding fathers felt about the troops, go read what they said about standing armies. You just Google Standing Armies, the Future of Freedom Foundation, and you'll see we've got them all there compiled. They abhorred standing armies. Why? Because they knew that standing armies are your greatest threat to freedom. That's what governments use to take away people's freedom, or standing armies. And so they would not permit a big standing army. I mean, none of this, overseas military bases, none of this, huge empire of domestic military. Okay, there was a basic military force, but it wasn't very large to do very much. Now, so this is a radically different society. I mean, they were kind of shining the light through statism, through the eons. We're all taught bad things about the Industrial Revolution. In the public schools and in the state universities, they teach that this was a horrible thing. They really teach that American men hated their wives and their children. I mean, they don't put it that directly, but that's their message when they say American men sent their wives and their children into factories for long working hours under horrible working conditions. They're really saying that they hated their wives and their children. It's not the case. The poverty was so rampant that this was the only way. When you've got a totally impoverished society, sometimes it's the only way to enable your family to survive, where everybody's working. But then gradually, as wealth starts accumulating, and that's what was happening in the 1800s, every 20 years, every generation, there'd be more capital, more savings, more wealth. That's what took wives out of the factories. That's what took children out of the factories, not the laws, because people are going to break laws if it means helping their children and their wives to survive. So here we have this remarkably different society, really an unhampered market economy with sound money, no income taxation, and gigantic amounts of wealth. And oh, by the way, the most amount of voluntary charity that mankind has ever seen. I mean, one man gave away $500 million, okay? And not because of an income tax deduction, and that was in real terms back in the 1800s, and imagine what that means today, because, well, there was no income tax, so it wasn't done because of an income tax deduction. But all that was abandoned, okay? We get the welfare state apparatus attached to this governmental system, the original governmental system, where you've got government now taking money from one group of people and giving it to another group. That's what Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, farm subsidies, the whole shooting match is all about. And then you've got the warfare state, the national security state apparatus that was grafted onto the original governmental system after World War II. So you got the Pentagon and the NSA, and and they justified it, saying, okay, they knew it was a totalitarian structure, but they said it's necessary to fight Soviet totalitarianism. The Soviet Union had been their partner in World War II and their ally, and now they turned against it and said, oh, now we got to fight this whole big Cold War, and we need a totalitarian apparatus. Well, that's been the great destroyer of our freedom and our well-being and our prosperity. The welfare state apparatus that was grafted on in the 30s, and then the warfare state apparatus that was grafted on in the 40s, and we've lived with it ever since. But we have the right to alter or abolish it, and that's where libertarianism comes in. That's where education comes in, because if enough people start recognizing this, that the welfare state apparatus and the warfare state apparatus are alien to the original founding principles of America, and that this is the root cause of the woes that we're suffering in this country, the economic woes, the terrorism woes, the surveillance woes, the assassinations, the torture, the whole kit and caboodle that has come with this way of life, this plunder society and this killing, destructive society that comes about with the welfare state and the warfare state, then all of a sudden we got a shot at changing the nature of this government. For example, repealing laws like they repealed the Patriot Act. I mean, that's what we have a right to do as Americans, to alter this form of government and to restore the principles that the government was founded on, and build on them. So the exceptions, well, we don't have slavery anymore, but the exceptions to it, the land grants and the Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890 and so forth, that we build on what they started in terms of a free society, and then we go further than that, and we lead not only the country out of this status morass that we're suffering, but we actually lead the world. So that's the show for this week, and thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next week.